Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Training Talk right here on Personal Defense Network. I'm Grant Cunningham, and this is a show where we talk about you, about your life, and how to protect it. In the next hour, we're going to explore how you can equip and prepare yourself to face your own worst case scenario and keep you and your family safe from harm. Now, we don't do politics or religion on this show, and you're not going to hear crazy conspiracy theories or fringe commentary, just reliable information that you can use to keep yourself safer today. If you enjoy the show, I hope you will share it with your friends and families, and coworkers and relatives and neighbors and all those people. Share it on Facebook and on Twitter and Instagram and all that other stuff if you would. I would really appreciate it. And something, I'll bet they'll appreciate it too. Give the gift in this. We're heading into the holiday season. Give the gift of safety and share Training Talk here on Personal Defense Network. So tonight, we're going to do a show about security while at prayer. We're now about a week and a half, probably a little over a week and a half, I think, out from a terrible attack on a church in Texas. And it's galvanized a lot of people, of course. So there's a lot of political wrangling going on, people talking about the need for new gun laws to protect the people against these kinds of attacks. We're looking at the attack itself and seeing what we could have done to prevent the attack. And as it turns out, there are some things. There were some significant lapses in the government background check for the guns, things like that. And of course, hopefully those will get addressed. But it's also caused a lot of people to talk about what to do in church, in the church itself, and what individual congregants can do to protect themselves. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I think this is going to be an incredibly important and informative episode. So sit back and I would suggest prepare to take notes, because I think there's going to be some interesting things coming here tonight. So my guests tonight are Joshua Gideon and Aaron Israel, and you know both of them if you've watched the show before. They've both been on the show a few times, and Joshua is an expert in security analysis and threat assessments, that kind of thing, and he's worked with a number of churches in his area and around the country doing that kind of thing. Aaron is, if you remember, Aaron is a defensive shooting instructor of some experience, and he's also taught people, both individual parishioners and informal security teams at various churches, how to do their job using defensive firearms. So, and for myself, I'm going to toot my own horn for once. I've been responsible for the security posture and responses at a large religious institution. I won't go into any more detail because the things I did there are still in operation, and operational security is important. But I do have some background in this area. So between the three of us, I think we're going to have some interesting things to talk about. So Aaron and Josh, welcome back to the show. Thank you both for being on.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
And Aaron's company, of course, is Fundamental Defense. Is that right, Aaron?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And Joshua, you keep muting yourself.
Sorry.
Remind everybody of your company again.
Which company?
No.
No, I'm not going to say publicly where I work for security reasons.
How about your own training company?
Yeah. Well, I have a company called Gideon Security where I do security training and consulting.
And in your day job, you are a security specialist for an unnamed company.
Yes.
And this is not the first unnamed company.
That's correct.
And so I know both of these gentlemen's background, and they're eminently qualified to be talking about this tonight. So I think we're going to start out looking at the what happens? I mean, what are the risks in churches? In the one in Texas that just happened, it looks, I would probably classify it as a domestic, because the gentleman, I guess, was after his mother or his mother-in-law. I don't remember.
Mother-in-law, I believe.
Yeah, mother-in-law, I believe. And but interestingly enough, although there's a component in a lot of mass casualty attacks, there's a component of domestic violence. Very often, we see this often in school killings, where the person will kill his parents or parent before going on a rampage. And in this case, there was. But Josh, you've got some interesting statistics based upon your research about what actually happens in terms of attacks in houses of worship, don't you?
Yeah, one of the good sources of information for this, and I see people cite his work all the time, but they don't give him credit. So I'm going to give him credit. The gentleman's name is Carl Chin, and he's been collecting this information for quite some time. And I remember back in, I believe it was 2011, that I doing some research and ran across his information back then, and he's kept that up to date. He has information going back from incidents from 1999 through the latest update on his website was looks like August 30th of this year. So he's definitely keeping the data up to date. So good source of information. But what we can kind of pull out of the data that he's provided is that looks like about 16% of these types of incidents are domestic spillovers. We're seeing about 25% of them being robberies of some sort. And, the statistics kind of go from there. The guns were used in 56% of the incidents. So,
wow. The surprising thing to me, I think, is the number of, first of all, the number of incidents.
Oh
and
yeah,
the number of people that are killed. It's really quite surprising, isn't it?
yeah. Let's see what's in. He's showing a statistic of 1,617 deadly force incidents.
Wow.
Since 1999.
And I think he's got a little over, I think, if I remember correctly, a little over 200 fatalities, something like that.
That was actually old data. The up-to-date data now shows 453, and that's before that's before the last couple incidents that have occurred.
Now, what's interesting is that I think when you start thinking about those numbers, we haven't heard about not all of these have been in the news, have they?
Yeah, some of them are kind of quietly reported, I guess you could say.
Okay. So not all of the incidents make the news, and it's a surprising number of people that get killed, and not just congregants, but the personnel, the staff of the congregation are very often attacked, aren't they?
Yeah, even people outside of the Carl Chin's particular statistics also take into account incidents that occur on the property as well. So, maybe a medical emergency that ended up happening. They stopped in the parking lot, and there was an issue there or something like that. So
wow. So it's not that a house of worship is necessarily a dangerous place to be, but I think the notion that it's a safer place to be is probably not entirely correct. Is that fair?
I would say so. What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a public place. I mean, it's even though it's a place where you go to congregate and to pray and to read the scripture, it's not necessarily any safer than any other public place. And just because you're doing those activities there doesn't really make it any less dangerous than any other public place. So,
Right.
Yeah, I think that I think probably a lot of people don't look at it in that way of a public space, in the way that they might say like a stadium or an auditorium or something, but it really is. Most congregations, of course, are welcoming of people. I mean, that's the whole thing, right?
Right.
To be welcoming to people who are seeking, and as a result, they tend to be open, and people can just walk in.
Right.
They don't even have to buy a ticket like they do in a movie theater.
Right.
So yeah, I think the first thing we should talk about then is the how the individual perceives what's going on in their house of worship, because again, we have sort of two parts of this. We have the part, what does the individual worshiper or perhaps family do when they're in these public places to protect themselves, and then what does the congregation or the congregational staff do to protect their congregants. So I think the first thing from the individual standpoint, and Aaron hit it, I think, is understand that you're in a public place, right?
yeah, absolutely. Understand that you're in a public place. And Joshua gave some statistics there about domestic incidents spilling over, and this most recent shooting in Texas was had a component like that to it. So one of the first things is knowing the people that you're going to church with, and having a relationship with them, and knowing what's going on in their personal lives. And if you have something going on in your personal life, communicating it to them. And if they've got that that son or daughter who's on kind of on the outs, or maybe an ex-spouse or a bad relationship or something that they're dealing with outside of church. Well, if that individual knows that you're at a church, then they might be more likely to target you there than if you were at your home where you got a locked door. So just knowing what's going on with the people around you is a good first step, and having those conversations and making sure that the people that need to be aware are aware. Like if you got a situation going on and you have a church security team or a resource officer, having that conversation with them that, hey, my crazy ex-husband or ex-boyfriend has been sending me crazy text messages, and I just wanted to let you know this is what he looks like. That gives the right people the heads up, and just being cognizant of that and communicating those things is a good first step.
Now, I remember reading something about this recent attack that the killer had texted or emailed his mother-in-law. I guess that was the attack, of the point of his attack. Had texted or emailed her that morning some threats. So there was some warning that something was going to happen.
Yeah, and that's, there's been situations I've been in at churches where the last one I can remember was a lady had an ex-spouse who had gotten violent, had a restraining order, that sort of thing. And she was coming to the church, and she told us about it. And so we, the deacons, and it was kind of an informal security team at that time, but the deacons and the guys who were greeting at the door knew who to watch for, knew what he looked like, knew what he drove. And so if he was to show up there, they could call the police and do what they needed to do to make sure there wasn't an incident. So communicating that sort of thing is a big help.
I think an important thing to remember here is that other than work, if someone is I guess devout, a religiously devout person, besides work, going to worship is probably going to be the other main thing during their week, for which they have a predictable schedule, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. They know where to find you.
Exactly. So this guy knew in this particular case that his mother-in-law was going to be there, and it was an easy thing for him to plan on. And it's an easy thing for, once we get away from those domestic things, some of the kinds of attacks that have happened, it's easy to predict when there are going to be staff present, because it's kind of like any other I hate to use the word business, but it's like a business because, staff is there certain hours of the day. They keep certain hours. And of course, they know an attacker would know when there would be a large number of people there because, again, churches don't keep their schedule secret for obvious reasons, right?
Right.
Yeah. So the question becomes in terms of once somebody is in church, and we'll start with the congregants and then we'll go to the staff. What can the individual person who is going to church every Sunday, maybe going to additional religious services, for some people that might be on Saturday, or for some people that might be, an evening thing during the week, whatever that happens to be. What can the individual person do when he or she is sitting in worship to keep themselves safe? Now, of course, a lot of people have suggested carrying a firearm, but let's talk about all the things that the individual can keep him or herself safe in these instances.
Well, pay attention to where you're sitting when you're inside of the building. They're usually these big meeting hall type places, and regardless of what I'm armed with or if I'm armed at all, it's not going to be good for me to be sitting in the center of the pew, or the center of the row of chairs in the middle of the sanctuary, where I can't easily get to an exit. I can't easily step out in the aisle if I wanted to confront the threat. Just knowing where you're positioned in that building, knowing where the exits are. And not just the main exits, but if there's an exit behind the stage that you could evade by getting back there and running out the back door or whatever. Just knowing where all of those entry and exit points are and being cognizant of where you're sitting when you're inside the building. And then second of all, understanding that regardless of what you're armed with, and I think this is kind of where there's a little bit of a disconnect, not only in churches, but when you think about schools and workplaces, even if the guy comes in with an AR, you're not defenseless, even if you don't have a gun. I mean, the thing can only hurt you if it's pointed at you. And there's lots of opportunities usually in these situations where if you have people that have the willingness to fight back with the attacker, regardless of whether they're armed with a firearm or a fire extinguisher or their bare hands, you might have the opportunity to do that. One of the videos I watched recently was the guy who shot up the airport in Florida when he got his gun out of his check bag. And there were like 6 or 7 people standing within 5 feet of the guy who could have easily tackled the guy and wrestled into the ground. And he may have only shot 1 or 2 people instead of, 10 plus, right? So having that willingness to fight and understanding that the gun is just a tool, and not letting, this type of a spree murderer go from pew to pew and just execute people, right? Having that willingness to fight. And one of the things you can do there, we talked about having conversations about what's going on in your life. Have conversations with people, regardless of whether they're quote unquote gun people or not, about the ability they have to fight back, and try to demystify the idea of the firearm. Like, they're not magical tools. They can be overcome if you have the willingness to do it and the opportunity. And there's usually opportunities to fight back in these situations that you got to be paying attention to. So
I think there was a certain aspect of that in this particular incident in Texas, where the attacker apparently faced no real resistance once he was in the church. And unfortunately, a lot of people, and please, folks, keep in mind, we're not at all being critical of the people who were injured and killed in that instance. But we do look at their actions and see if there's something we can learn from them. And in a lot of cases, and there are a lot of firsthand accounts of people, ducking for cover under the pews, and the fellow walking by and just, methodically shooting people. So I think it's, for a lot of people, it's very, very hard. It's hard normally to make that jump from, I'm watching a movie, now I need to confront an active attacker.
right.
I think it's probably a much more difficult jump from, here I am, praying and thinking about peace and all the stuff that goes with worship, and then suddenly having to deal with an attacker. Do you think that might have an impact on people's ability to fight back?
Certainly it does. I mean, you don't go to church expecting to get into a fight. That's probably the furthest thing from your mind when you're there to worship and do whatever your religious activities are. But I mean, there's evidence in Scripture where, I mean, Jeremiah and his guys carried swords while they were rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, right? Because it was necessary at the time, given the context they lived in. Well, these attacks are not really getting more frequent, statistically speaking, I don't think, but they are a thing that's going to continue to happen. So you got to be thinking about that, and just, you can kind of have your head in the sand about it. But if you accept reality for what it is and you watch the news, like, you've got to kind of conceptualize that this could happen to me. It probably won't, but you don't get to choose the time and the place, right? So it's you got to be able to have those two trains of thought going in your mind simultaneously. Of, yes, I'm here to worship, but at the same time, this is still part of the public space, and even though it's sacred ground to me, it may be a potential killing field for the guy who's looking for an opportunity. So,
It goes back to something that I've said for a long time, that self-defense ultimately starts with a decision made by you that you will do whatever it takes to protect your life and the lives of your young ones. And particularly, there are some religions where that is a requirement. The preservation of one's own life is that rises above all of the other laws or precepts in a lot of cases. And there are certain religions where that is very true. But it requires that decision that, yes, I will do whatever it's going to take to save my life. And that's a tough decision for a lot of people to make, even outside of church. But
yeah,
that one has to come first.
There's a great book for people of faith written by a friend of mine named Greg Hopkins called A Time to Kill. And it takes that verse from Ecclesiastes about there's a time for everything under the sun, one of those being taking human life to preserve life. And he goes into a lot of detail about how to get over the moral humps that you might have as a believer, whatever your faith may be, especially if you got a biblical-based faith, Judeo-Christian beliefs. Then there's a lot of support for the idea that you just talked about of preserving life above all, even if it means taking the life of that person who is trying to hurt other people. So
it's funny you should mention that, because being a child of the 60s, there was a song, of course, back in the 60s or 70s that used that passage in a song. So you're talking about it, and that now that tune is running through my mind, and now I can't get it out of my mind. So
you're welcome.
Thanks a lot for that, Aaron. Appreciate that. So yeah, that's the first thing. So when you're talking about with people about using a firearm to defend themselves if they're attacked in worship, what are some of the issues that you talk with them about? I mean, beyond the issue of the moral question of whether you should carry in church and that kind of thing, the practical aspects of defending yourself or the people around you in church with a firearm. What do you talk about with them?
Well, the first thing, if you're carrying a gun in church and you plan to be a part of that response and to try to stop the threat with your firearm, the first thing I'm gonna do is have a conversation with the people that I sit with in my family that, hey, this is something that I would respond to if something were to go down inside the sanctuary. So them knowing what to do when you stand up to go and confront whoever the threat is, knowing that your family knows what to do to get out of the way, to seek cover. Do they know what cover is? Do they know where the exits are, same as you should? Having that conversation with them to get out of the way, because you're probably going to become a target if you stand up and confront the bad guy, right? So that's the first thing, is communicate with the people you sit with, your family members, that you plan to respond so that they know how to do what they need to do. Second thing is it's a lot different shooting in the most likely worst case scenario where you've got a single attacker and it's like a robbery type situation or a physical assault, one individual on another. It's quite different when you're talking about a room full of people, right? So you want to make sure that you're waiting for the right opportunity to respond with deadly force because of all of the innocent bystanders that are around, right? So you want to be very comfortable with your ability to make precise shots, right? So the requirement for precision when there's a lot of people around is going to be a lot higher than if it was just you and another individual in one of the more common worst case scenarios. So your ability to hit that head size 3.5-inch circle type target under stress while there's a lot of people around becomes very important. And then on top of that, taking a shot probably at a little bit more distance than what you're accustomed to in normal personal defense situations, because auditoriums, even though they don't seem that way, there's a lot of distance in there. The attacker could be all the way across the sanctuary from you. Are you going to close the distance with them? And when are you comfortable in taking that precise shot? 25 yards on the range is the same as 25 yards in a building, right? So you've got to get a little bit more practice at distance, I think, than most of us are comfortable with if you're going to respond to the active shooter type event. So that's what kind of things I would tell them right off the front. And then, of course, when do you get the firearm out? You don't want to be moving through the crowd of people with a gun drawn if you don't have to. So you want to, if you can get that gun, get your hand on the gun while it's still under concealment, move through the people you need to move to close with the shooter and get to where you can take a shot. Those are all things that you can practice on the range with different drills that you got to be thinking about that are kind of outside the bounds of what I would normally tell people for just, most likely worst case scenario for personal defense context. This is a little bit different. So that's the active shooter type response. But then aside from that, though, like Josh pointed out, most of the situations that happen at churches are not active shooter mass killer events. They're the domestic violence spilling over. They're targeting someone. Maybe you're in the right place at the right time when they target that someone. Maybe they're coming after a nursery worker when you're picking up your kids. And then it's just the same things I would tell you to practice for personal defense. Being able to make that rapid multiple shot string of fire, stop the threat at that 10 to 15 yard distance that's most common for personal defense. Start with those skills and then add on the things I was just talking about for active shooter after you've kind of mastered those skills. So those are kind of where I would start.
Okay, cool. One of the things I'm thinking here as I'm looking at some of the reports of this incident, one of the interesting things and this goes back to something you mentioned earlier, is that a lot of people, of course, in the gun world, and we're all the three of us are all part of the gun world. And one of the things, of course, that happens whenever anything like this happens, the first thing out of people's mouth is the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And I think it's important to reiterate that that's just not true. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy or gal, period.
Absolutely.
That's sort of the end of it. And we go back to, just because you don't have a gun does not mean you're defenseless against these people. And I want to keep reiterating that, because I think a lot of people are getting the idea that, oh my gosh, the only way I'm going to ever be safe at church is to have a gun on me, and that may or may not be true.
Yeah, I think if you can accept the willingness to fight with or without a gun, that's a first natural step, and then you might progress towards understanding that a gun makes it more efficient if you're willing to go to that level of force. So, it's good people, not just the tool is irrelevant. It's the willingness to fight that matters.
Right. Does most of your recommendations do they hold for church staff protecting themselves as well? Because of course the church staff is often the threat of violence outside of the worship service itself. So anything different for them in terms of defending themselves with a firearm?
No, I mean, I would give them the same recommendations as I would anybody who's interested in self-defense with a firearm. The basic fundamentals I talked about. The only thing with the staff is that the staff usually includes ushers, deacons, people who greet people at the door. They've got a special role, and I'm sure Josh will talk more about it on the institutional level, but they get to size people up as they're walking into the congregation, right? The pastor's shaking hands with people. The deacons are meeting people as they come through the door, and paying attention to those possible pre-threat cue type things is something where they can make a big difference that maybe you as an individual parishioner wouldn't be interacting as much with everybody coming into the door. So I think that's knowing your congregation and paying attention to what's going on Sunday morning would be a big help.
Okay. And this is going to be a personal question for you, and if you don't want to answer it, I'll understand. But let's say your church, denomination, whatever, forbids the carrying of weapons, even if they don't have the legal right to do. But suppose they have a more what they feel is a moral objection to the carrying of weapons. Would you recommend that people carry in church anywhere?
Personally, yes, I would. I mean, I've attended churches before where, besides me and a couple other guys, we're the only guys who were really quote unquote gun people. And you run into, depending on which congregation you're in and how they take certain passages in scripture, they may have a more pacifistic view, but that's their view, right? That's not my view. And if they don't have a legal right to keep me from carrying a firearm, if they're not doing what they have to in Texas to legally prevent me from carrying, then I'm, whatever their moral guideline is, that's on them. I'm gonna carry my defensive tools. So
cool. Thank you. You did. I'm glad you answered that, because I know that's something that that bothers a lot of people. They're barred. Or is it proper to carry a gun in church? And I've seen a lot of that on the internet after this incident as well. So let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about, from the other side of it, from the institutional side of it, what we do to protect not just the congregation, but the staff in houses of worship. And this is where I've got a little more experience, and I know Josh has got vast experience in this area. So Josh, where do we start? Like, you've got a religious organization, a congregation, be it a church or a synagogue or perhaps a mosque or something like that. Where do we start with these institutions to look at threats and keep everybody safe?
Sure. Well, I think that it's important for them to understand that any group that organizes that has a set time where a bunch of people get together, in a fairly open environment, they have the responsibility to consider the security of those people. And there's some challenges to getting that through to some congregations, but it's typically what you find is one person in the congregation is that guy that's leading that charge. And over time, he or she is able to collect other people, and they push the progress forward there. It's a long road. There are congregations that I've been a part of that never got there beyond the initial talking about it. There are others that have made great progress with that. But when I do consulting with these with congregations, what I try to do is I start with a risk assessment, and mainly because no one church is like any other church. There's different sizes of congregations. There's different threats in their area. So doing a pretty thorough risk assessment kind of does a few things. It helps them understand what things they need to be addressing, but it also helps them to take that information to the rest of the members of the congregation and go, see, I'm not just wearing a tinfoil hat here. I'm, there's some real threats here that we need to be addressing. So that's where I'd start.
It's interesting that you talk about the responsibility, because I think a lot of religious leaders will say, well, I have a responsibility to provide a welcoming environment for people, and I know this is true from the Jewish side, and I assume it's true from the Christian side as well, that we have a responsibility to provide a welcoming and egalitarian, if that's appropriate, all that kind of thing. But left out of that is that part of that open and welcoming congregation is also keeping them safe. And
that's right. And
I'm glad you mentioned
both. Yeah, it's not that difficult to do both. You can still provide that level of discrete security, and and integrate it in with what looks normal. So to your congregants, to the members of the congregation, it looks normal. To an outsider that's looking in, they see the indicators of security there.
So let's talk a little bit about security, from the institutional standpoint. And one of the things that I think is important, and we'll see if you are on the same page, is from an institutional standpoint. And I hate to put it this way, it's not like meddling in people's lives, but generally having a pretty good idea of what's going on in the congregation's lives. And Aaron kind of touched on that a little bit about, the members in the congregation knowing what's going on with each other. There's also, I think, an importance that the staff, the leaders, the ministers / priests / rabbis / whatever, have a good idea, who's having domestic issues, who's having a personal beef with another member of the congregation, who's having custody issues, right? All of this stuff, maybe even who's having money or substance abuse issues, who has a child who maybe be having emotional issues. So it's really keeping in touch with everybody in the congregation, which in theory is the staff's job anyway. But keeping in touch with these and thinking about it, not just in terms of helping them, but in terms of keeping that from becoming a problem for either them or the other person in the congregation. What would you say to that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. Aaron and I are definitely on the same page there. That threat intelligence side needs to be a constant thing that's being done, not only from a security perspective, but just these are members of your church. You're asking people who are sinners to come into your congregation so that you can help them. We've all had some kind of bad things in our past that we were trying to, we're going to this church for a reason.
Not me. I've been a saint all my life.
Some people are tempted, with certain things, and that, that's something that we need to be aware of as a congregation. Are we putting people in a situation that may tempt them to, steal, the collection plate, or things like that, So having that threat intelligence, knowing the congregation, is extremely important. Just like what we were talking about with the domestic situations, if you can have an idea of what's happening ahead of time, and your security teams, if you have an established security team, that's good information that they should be discussing amongst themselves and putting plans in place for that. We look at the police scanner to see what's going on in the area. There's a lot of ways to bring in that intel information to help you make decisions on how you deal with the threats that for your worship services or other events.
One of my jobs in that area was to meet on a regular basis with both the local police leadership and the local office of the FBI, who tracked hate crimes and gang activity and that kind of thing, and that went into our planning as well. And we looked at it. We also looked at it at not just the threat intelligence, of course, which is important, but then we also went into the physical security of the facility. What do we do to prevent entrance, both in terms of violence and of course in terms of just crime? I mean, that figures into it too. So that got put into the mix as well. Has that been your experience?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I want to, kind of a rings of protection system. I want to stop everything out in the parking lot. Yeah, on the furthest edge of the parking lot. Whatever the end of my responsibility is, I want to stop it there. So, pushing that your capability of responding to threats out to those edges, that's I guess the ultimate goal of that. And there's a number of ways to do that. We've not really talked about medical issues and things like that as well. So it's not just active shooter type incidents. It's where do I want to deal with a medical issue? Well, I'd prefer to deal with it out in the parking lot, where the ambulance can come and pick the person up and not have to disrupt the worship service that's going on.
Physical security and controlling access in some way becomes important, and it's a little easier in some congregations and some religions than others. Knowing, of course, if you can have people who are at the door who know who should be there, that's an important part of it. Because once we get beyond the congregant on congregant crime, if we're talking about outside crime coming in, crimes of harassment or things like that, it becomes important to know who's coming in and having ways to identify them. And again, this is easy or hard depending upon the denomination and all that kind of thing.
I think most congregations are open to the idea of having greeters or ushers. So it's an easy transition to integrate those people into your security team, where they're actually the ones that are, greeting those people at the door. They're the ones that are, checking those people that are coming in, depending on the size of the congregation and the threat levels, you might even have people inside that are sitting there that are, sitting on a back pew that are constantly observing people. Not all church shooters, come in the back door and just start shooting the place up. We've had instances where they've sat down, gone through half the service, and then got up and started shooting people. So having those people in place, and they need to be trained. They need to know what they're looking for.
So we're getting now into the subject that I think interests a lot of people, and we've sort of mentioned, all three of us now have kind of mentioned this. What does a house of worship security team look like? What do they do, and how should they be trained?
Okay. In my opinion, I think they should be discreet. I think that they need to have a formal plan in place. I do workshops to help these congregations establish that structure, and then take that further. And let them get, go to guys like Aaron to get the firearms training that they need, and those experts in the field get medical training, get the pieces that they need to fill the gaps in their threat assessment. So I think that it's I can't stress enough the discreetness of it.
Yeah, you don't want people feel like they're in a lockdown, right?
Right, exactly. My ultimate goal with that, and this is what I try to stress to the congregations that I've worked with, is I want the people that come in that know nothing about security, just your average congregant, to not know what I'm there for. I want them to walk past me and I smile and shake their hand, and they don't realize that they don't even realize what I'm doing. At the same time, I want the bad guys or people that have bad intent to look and go, wait a second, that's somebody I don't want to mess with. And oh, they have security in place.
Right.
Oh, why are those guys carrying radios around? Oh, wow, there may be more than one of them.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. I'm glad you broached the topic, because communication is important here.
Absolutely.
So, are they going to be carrying radios, or are they going to have maybe coiled earpieces or something? What do you do?
One of the things I recommend is the people out in the public areas, so your lobby areas, I want them to have radios in their hand.
Oh,
interesting.
Yeah.
And the people, without killing OPSEC here, but there are people that you can put elsewhere that may have coiled earpieces or things like that are attached to the radio system that are feeding information, from inside the auditorium to outside areas.
Okay.
Maybe somebody sitting in a vehicle outside, letting you know what's going on. Especially if a lot of incidents occur in the parking lots, maybe not a bad idea there.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Interesting that's one I hadn't thought about.
Also, having security cameras in place that the security team can observe the vehicles coming in. A lot of churches are set up to where there's a lot of blind spots in the parking area because they're trying to park so many people. The parking lots are just huge, so it's hard to cover that much area. So they cameras can definitely help with that.
So the security team needs to understand. First of all, they need to understand how to be low profile. They need to understand basic communication and identification concepts. Right. They need to be able to communicate with each other. They probably need to be friendly and outgoing. They should have some medical training, some idea of the physical security of the facility. So, what's the role of an armed security team?
I think it's the same. I think it's pretty much the same. You're layering security there. With people, your greeter can be armed, discreetly, concealed. Nobody has to know that they have firearm on them. I'm not a big proponent of open carrying at church, especially, mainly for some of the reasons that we've talked about there. I'm sensitive to other people's views on, if they have pacifistic views. I don't want to be a stumbling block to them, but at the same time, I'm still going to carry my firearm. As responsibilities are a little bit different on a security team, in that, I personally, if you can legally do it, I would have them armed anyway. Everyone on the team.
One caveat off of that I see a lot, because people come to me because in Texas now it's legal to have an armed security team, and they don't have to necessarily have the licensing from the state anymore, which is a great evolution in the law. But what you don't want to do, and unfortunately too many congregations I've talked to are moving in this direction, is just say, okay, let's have a free license to carry class, and let's arm our security team after that license to carry class. I had a church reach out to me and say, hey, will you do a licensing class? And I said, only if it is part one of like a 2 or 3 day training session, then yeah, I'll get you guys licensed, but that's just the starting point. That's freshman orientation, right?
Right.
There's way too many congregations that are thinking, okay, well, if we've got guys who are licensed to carry, let's just grab those guys that are licensed to carry and tell them to carry their guns, and now they're the security team, and they don't do any of those other things that you talked about. And especially on the firearm piece, they just kind of assume they're going to be able to do what they need to do with their firearm if it comes to that. And I think there's a lot of naivety in that area.
Yeah. I would agree with that. So from a training standpoint, Aaron, how does the training for a member of a security team differ than what you would give for just the individual wanting to be armed while they're at church?
Well, there's communication aspects to it. There's learning how to, because if I'm teaching somebody just in a regular personal defense shooting class, you're not really going to have them worried about talking to the threat, de-escalation, anything like that, communicating with the people on the line who are on their team, because they're just random people off the street. So you want to have that whole aspect built into the class of, okay, here's some communication type drills we can do integrated with our defensive shooting. And here's how we can work together as 2 or 3 man teams confronting a threat. And then the things I talked about before, like being very comfortable with taking a precise shot. Probably I'm going to include in the fundamentals for a team, being able to shoot from some more compromised positions, kneeling, falling down, that sort of thing that I might not include for an individual. But when you're dealing with a crowd and you're part of a security team, you may have to, for instance, take a knee to take a headshot so that you don't, if you miss, you're not having a pass through, it goes into the congregation, right? So you have those angles that you want to think about. So having that ability to make those more precise shots, those shots at distance, and then communicate with the people around you and integrate with your team members as you're confronting that threat, and understanding sectors of fire, where you have a good clean shot to take inside of the congregation. There's only, just like in home defense, there's only certain places in your house where you want to take a shot. Well, it's the same thing inside of a big meeting hall, right? So thinking about all of those things that may be more quote unquote advanced skills for the individual. If I'm on a security team, then those need to be things that I think about right off the bat and train a lot more detail on. So.
Good points. A lot of this comes back down to the responsibility of the security team member to confront the problem, right, as opposed to what we usually talk about. The individual's responsibility is to get himself out of the situation as quickly and efficiently, as safely as possible. So they're 2 completely different jobs, and that that concealed handgun license course that you took probably isn't going to prepare you for that job of being on the security team. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, and you need to know who the licensees are in your congregation too. That's the thing that
I was about to say the same thing, Aaron.
If a bunch of people, I mean, it wouldn't be a bunch of people probably, but if you know who the licensees are, if there's some other good guy with a gun, to use that cliche, in the building with you, you need to know not to shoot that guy, right? He's part of the response, right?
Right. I think it's important that everyone in the congregation has a role. They know, they've been told what they need to do. Armed, unarmed, whatever it is. You are not going to be armed. Okay. See that person in a wheelchair over there? Your responsibility is to get them out of the building. people, so I think, especially in big groups like that, they need to be given responsibilities, and be told what to do.
Yeah, how many sanctuaries have a defibrillator, one of those AED
Right.
type kits, and a blowout kit staged somewhere? Probably not very many, but that's something you definitely want to consider, right?
Absolutely.
So this whole thing is a whole lot more complex than just finding some guys in the congregation who want to carry a gun.
Absolutely.
And I hope that the people who are listening are getting this idea that it's well beyond the good guy with a gun. When we start talking about what happens, not only to prevent the incident from happening in the first place, we have to deal with preventing it, recognizing it as early as possible, right? And then deciding very quickly on what the response is going to be. And I'm glad you brought up the part about knowing who in the congregation is armed, because, the good guy with the gun, standing up, pulling his gun out, is doing a convincing imitation of another attacker.
That's exactly right. That's one of the things that, when I do training for congregations, I have scenarios that I put them through.
Right.
And one of the cards is, just some random guy in the audience stands up during an active shooter incident and pulls out a gun. And, half the time that person gets shot. Unfortunately, they didn't prepare in time, ahead of time, to let the, organized security team know that they were armed, and they became by default became a threat.
At this point in time, I want to interject something with which I've had personal experience. There are those congregations or congregational leaders who reject the notion of self-security and instead will do something like hiring an off-duty police officer for, holidays or something. And I've seen this happen far too often. Aside from the fact that doesn't give you any of the other important parts of the security package, the prevention and early detection and identification, all that other stuff that goes with it. The other issue is that the average police officer, or even the well above average police officer, has no concept, no clue of the issues dealing with discharging firearms inside of a group of worshipers. This is not part of their training. It's not what they do. I suspect there are maybe some high-end tactical units that might have those skills, but you usually don't get to hire those guys off duty. So it's important that this is going way, way, way beyond hiring an off-duty cop to sit in outside or in the congregation during services, or even worse, hiring armed security. I can't think of any armed security that I've ever seen anywhere in this country that would have the necessary knowledge and ability to do this job. I'm open if you guys have actually seen any, but I sure haven't.
No, I think uniform security, whether it's a resource officer or some kind of security team that you hire, that's just kind of, you could certainly, I've seen churches integrate them into their layers of security, but that's kind of the overt deterrence type idea at the very front end. Like, okay, this is our outer ring of, okay, it gives people a warm and fuzzy that they see the police, the sheriff's officer when they're walking in the door. But like you said, I mean, they're not, as far as the detection and response aspect, they're incidental to it. It's just more of a warm and fuzzy for the people in the congregation than anything else.
And I think that's the best way to put it.
Yep.
Warm and fuzzy. All right. So we're out of time. So let's wrap this up. Guys, thank you very much for coming on. It was a great conversation. Aaron, where can people find you and contact you and get your training and services and all that stuff?
You can find me on the web at fundamentaldefense.com and search Fundamental Defense on any of the social media, and you'll find me. And I'm also a regular contributor on Armed Lutheran Radio. So if you want to hear my weekly self-defense tips, subscribe to that podcast, and you'll hear me every week.
And I have appeared on Armed Lutheran Radio a time or two. Great podcast. Even if you're not Lutheran, I'm not Lutheran, and it's a good podcast. Josh, how do people get in touch with you?
You can't find me.
He's just that secret squirrel, folks.
Now, I have a couple websites, personaldefensetech.com and GideonSecurity.com. And I'm on Facebook and Twitter and about all the social medias out there. So
you're just a social butterfly. That's you. All right. So everybody, thank you for tuning in. I've got a deal for you on premium membership here at Personal Defense Network. We've got a lot of videos on these kinds of topics in the premium membership side of the site, and you can get your first year of access for only $10. It's usually $39.95. You can get it for $10. If when you go to checkout for premium membership, just put in this code GRANT10, GRANT, the number 1, the number 0, all one word, and you'll get your first year for $10. Take a look, because there's a lot of resources here at Personal Defense Network for these kinds of topics and a whole bunch of others as well. So take advantage of those. Take advantage of the deal for premium membership at Personal Defense Network. Again, GRANT10, GRANT, the number 1, the number 0, $10 for your first year. So check that out. Of course, I'm always interested in your emails. Please send them to grant@grantcunningham.com. Always happy to hear from you. Get those emails. Just don't talk about my hair anymore. I'm tired of the emails about my hair, okay? So please check that out. Of course, you can always reach me at grantcunningham.com, of course, here at Personal Defense Network. And our next Training Talk episode is going to be December the 7th, so 2 weeks from tonight, which is the first Thursday of December. We are closing out the year. By the way, don't miss our gala year-end episode, which is going to be the 21st of December, just before Christmas. We're going to gather as many of the guests of Training Talk that we've had throughout the year, as many of them as we can get in one hangout, and we're just going to have an awesome round table of self-defense topics. So be sure to check that out. December is going to be an awesome month here at Personal Defense Network. So next time, same place, December 7th, for more self-defense and personal safety talk here at Training Talk. Until then, stay safe, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.